You don't want to move very fast. You want to try to keep something between you and your target.
Tom Oar lived by one rule: the wilderness doesn't lie, but people do. For decades, he was the heartbeat of the Yaak Valley, a man who carved a life out of frozen Montana dirt with nothing but a knife and a woman who never left his side. He didn't have a backup plan because he didn't believe in them, but in 2026, the silence in the mountains became deafening. The man who survived grizzly bears and 50-below winters faced something that broke him. Tom Oar didn't just walk away. He lost everything he spent 80 years building. What happened? And why is the truth making the entire mountain men community deeply uncomfortable? Stay with us. This is deeper than you thought. The man the camera found. Before the fame, before the television crews, before any of it, Tom Oar was just a man who preferred the company of trees to people. That tells you everything you need to know about him. He was born in 1943 in Illinois, United States. Not exactly the kind of place that produces legends. Flat land, ordinary streets, a childhood that looked like a million other childhoods in post-war America. Nothing about it suggested that this particular boy would one day disappear into the Montana wilderness and make the rest of the country feel guilty for owning a microwave. But Tom was never ordinary. Not really. From a young age, he had an instinct for physical things. Horses, rope work, the kind of outdoor skills that most boys played at, but Tom actually mastered. By the time he reached adulthood, that instinct had pulled him toward one of the most physically punishing careers a man could choose: professional rodeo. He competed for years, roping, riding, enduring. Rodeo is not a glamorous life. It is bruises, early mornings, and towns that blur together after a while. But Tom thrived in it. He was built for discomfort. He didn't just tolerate the hard parts. He seemed to need them. And that is the first thing you have to understand about Tom Oar. Ease made him restless. The challenge made him come alive. The rodeo years sharpened him, but they didn't complete him. Something was still missing, and Tom, being Tom, went looking for it in the most extreme place he could find. He found Nancy first. Nancy Oar is one of those people who doesn't get enough credit in the story. She was the quiet engine behind everything Tom would eventually build. Strong, capable, and completely uninterested in the kind of life most people settle for. When Tom told her he wanted to leave everything behind and move somewhere genuinely remote, she didn't flinch. That matters more than it sounds. In the 1970s, Tom and Nancy made a decision that most people would call reckless. They left the life they knew and moved to the Yaak River Valley in the far northwestern corner of Montana. And when we say far, we mean far. Yaak is the kind of place that doesn't show up easily on maps. The kind of place where your nearest neighbor might be 30 miles away. It's a place where winter doesn't visit. It moves in and refuses to leave. They built a life there from almost nothing. It started with a cabin and a routine, a rhythm that had nothing to do with clocks or schedules or the noise of the outside world. Tom learned to trap. He taught himself the nearly extinct art of brain-tanning animal hides, a process so labor-intensive and so precise that very few people in the entire country still practiced it. He became genuinely skilled at the kind of work that kept men alive in the 1800s. This wasn't a hobby, it was survival and identity. For decades, Tom and Nancy lived this way, quietly, purposefully, completely off the grid. They weren't hiding from anything. They had simply found the one place where life made sense to them, and they stayed. Then in 2012, a television producer came looking. The History Channel was developing a new series about people who lived off the land in extreme conditions. They needed real people, locations, and stakes. They wanted faces that could carry a show. Somebody gave them Tom Oar's name. The story goes that Tom wasn't exactly enthusiastic. A man who had spent decades building a life around solitude doesn't naturally jump at the idea of camera crews trampling through his property. He had no interest in being packaged and sold to a television audience, but he said yes, eventually. And when Mountain Men premiered in May of 2012, something unexpected happened. America didn't just watch Tom Oar, they fell in love with him. Here was a man who had opted out of everything modern life demanded and built something real on the other side of that decision. He wasn't performing toughness, he was the thing itself. The ratings reflected it. Mountain Men became one of History Channel's most watched series. Tom Oar became its quiet, undeniable heart. But the life Tom was living had a shadow side that the cameras never quite caught, and that shadow was already growing. The legend of Yak. Most people watch survival shows from a couch with a blanket and a snack within reach. Tom Oar didn't have a couch. That's not a joke. While millions of viewers were watching mountain men from the comfort of heated living rooms, Tom was actually living the version of life they were watching. No editing breaks. He had no hotel room waiting at the end of the shoot day, nor a production assistant handing him a warm coffee between takes. What the cameras captured was real. And real, in Yak Valley, was brutal. Let's talk about where Tom actually lived, because most people hear remote Montana and picture something scenic, a postcard, or a painting above a fireplace. Yak Valley is not that. It sits in the very northwestern tip of Montana, pressed right up against the Idaho border. It is one of the most heavily forested and least populated places in the entire continental United States. The town of Yak itself has a population that has hovered around 100 people for as long as anyone can remember, some years fewer. There is one bar, one small store, and beyond that, wilderness in every direction. Winter temperatures in Yak regularly drop to 30 below zero. Not wind chill, actual temperature. The snow doesn't dust the ground, it buries it. Roads become impassable. Supply runs become impossible for weeks at a stretch. If something breaks in January, you either fix it yourself or go without it. Tom Oar went without. Regularly. By choice. His daily life looked nothing like what most Americans would recognize as normal. He rose early and worked with his hands from morning until the light gave out. Trapping was the foundation of his income and his survival. He ran trap lines through the surrounding wilderness, checking them in temperatures that would send most grown men back inside. But the trapping was almost secondary to the craft. Brain tanning hides is a process that most people have never heard of and would not believe if you described it to them. You take the brain of an animal, typically the same animal whose hide you are preparing, and you use it to tan the leather. The logic behind it is ancient. Every animal, as the old saying goes, has just enough brain to tan its own hide. Tom had learned this process to a depth of knowledge that went far beyond that of hobbyists. He produced buckskin clothing, moccasins, and leather goods that were genuinely museum quality. People across the country sought out his work specifically. This was a dying art. Tom Oar was one of the last people keeping it alive. Tom carried knowledge that universities couldn't teach, knowledge that would vanish completely when the last few people who held it were gone. That weight sat on him whether he acknowledged it or not. Nancy stood at the center of all of it. She was not a background character. She was not the supportive wife waiting at home while Tom had adventures. Nancy worked alongside him and maintained the cabin. She managed the garden that helped keep them fed through the long Montana winters. She was, by every account of people who knew them, the reason the whole operation functioned. Tom was the face. Nancy was the foundation. Mountain Men made all of this visible to the world. The show premiered in May of 2012 and found an audience almost immediately. By its second season, it was pulling in over 2 million viewers per episode. The History Channel had found exactly what it was looking for: authentic people in real danger doing original work. Tom's segments consistently drew the strongest reactions. Viewers responded to something in him that was difficult to name but impossible to miss. He wasn't performing for the camera. Tom wasn't playing a character. He was simply being himself, and himself happened to be extraordinary. Fame arrived in Yak like an uninvited guest. Fan mail started coming. Interview requests, appearance invitations. The outside world, which Tom had spent decades deliberately keeping at a distance, came flooding back in through the television screen. People wanted a piece of the man who had opted out of modern life. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. Here was a man famous for his solitude, suddenly surrounded by attention. He was a man who had built his entire identity around self-sufficiency. Now the story has changed, and he is dependent on a television network's production schedule. Fame has a way of changing things. Sometimes it protects you, Other times, it makes you a target, and for Tom Oar, it would eventually do both. But before the story turns, there is something about those years in the spotlight that nobody talks about enough. Something that was silently building beneath the surface of every celebrated episode. The cracks were already forming, and they ran deeper than anyone watching could see. Cracks beneath the wilderness. There is a version of the Tom Oar story that stops at the highlight reel, the trapping and the tanning. The rugged Montana winters were survived on skill and stubbornness. That version is inspiring. It is also incomplete, because behind every celebrated episode of Mountain Men, something else was happening. Either the production lights didn't reach, or the editing room couldn't package it into a tidy narrative. Tom Oar was getting older. That sounds simple. It isn't. When you are living the life Tom was living, age doesn't just slow you down. It comes for you with everything it has. Every year in Yaak Valley demands a physical toll that most people will never understand. Hauling equipment through chest-deep snow, running trap lines in temperatures that freeze, expose skin in minutes, splitting wood for hours just to stay warm enough to sleep. A younger body absorbs that punishment. An older one keeps a running tab. By the time Mountain Men was deep into its run, Tom was well into his 70s. And the body that had carried him through decades of rodeo and wilderness living was quietly presenting its bill. Now, here is the first thing most fans never knew. Tom had been dealing with health concerns that rarely made it into the show's narrative. The production focused on triumph, on skill, and the romance of the off-grid life. It did not linger on the nights when Tom's joints made the simplest tasks feel impossible, and did not show the conversations he and Nancy had in private about how much longer they could sustain this pace. Television shows sell a version of reality. They are not obligated to show you all of it. But the people closest to Tom knew. And what they knew was that the life in Yaak, as magnificent as it was, had a shelf life. That shelf life was expiring faster than anyone wanted to admit. Nancy's situation added another layer entirely. Nancy Oar had always been the quiet strength behind everything. But quiet strength still has limits. She had given as much to that life in Yaak as Tom had, possibly more. And the years were registering on her too. The extreme isolation that had once felt like freedom was beginning to feel like something else, something heavier, so strong that two aging people couldn't sustain indefinitely without consequences. There is a question that doesn't get asked enough about the Mountain Men era, and it is this. At what point does a chosen life become a trap? Tom built Yaak into an identity, not just a location. An entire sense of self was wrapped up in that land, that cabin, that way of living. Walking away from it wouldn't just mean changing a dress. It would mean dismantling the thing that had defined him for decades. That is not a small thing for any man. For a man like Tom Oar, it was enormous. Behind the scenes, tensions were also surfacing around the production itself. Reality television has a machinery to it that runs on conflict and drama. Producers need story arcs. They need stakes and moments. And sometimes the gap between what producers need and what a real person's actual life provides creates friction. Tom was not a man who performed well under those conditions. He was genuine to his core and had little patience for manufactured drama. Multiple reports from people familiar with the production suggested that Tom grew increasingly uncomfortable with the way the show framed certain situations. He had signed up to share his life, not to have it scripted. That discomfort was growing, quietly but steadily. And it was converging with the physical reality of his age and Nancy's needs in a way that was pushing toward one inevitable conclusion. Something had to give. Nobody expected what came next. Not his fans or the network. Even the people closest to him were shocked. Because Tom Oar was the kind of man who endured, who adapted, and always find a way to make the hard thing work when everyone else would have folded. The idea that he would one day simply stop was almost unthinkable to the people who watched him every week. Yet, the signs were there for anyone willing to look past the legend, past the buckskin and the trap lines and the mythology that mountain men had built around him. The man behind the legend was tired. And a tired man in Tom Oar's position only has one move left: the day he walked away. Some men announce their exits, they give interviews, or post farewell messages, and make sure the world knows they are leaving and exactly why. Tom Oar was not that kind of man. When he left, he simply left. No press release, not one emotional goodbye episode, nor a carefully worded statement through a publicist. One season, he was there. And then, quietly, without fanfare, he wasn't. That silence confused people. It still does. Mountain Men ran for 12 seasons on the History Channel. Tom appeared consistently through the earlier years, becoming the show's most recognizable face alongside cast members like Marty Maiorato and Rich Lewis. His segments drew the strongest viewer responses season after season. People searched for his name the most, and then his chapter closed. The official narrative was straightforward enough. Tom and Nancy had decided to leave Yaak Valley to relocate somewhere less demanding, somewhere that made sense for where they were in life. The extreme conditions of northwestern Montana, manageable in your 40s and 50s, become something else entirely in your late 70s. That part is understandable. It even makes sense. But here is what the official narrative left out. Leaving Yaak wasn't just a logistical decision. It was the unraveling of an entire identity. Tom hadn't just lived in that valley. He had become it. His name and that land were inseparable in the minds of everyone who had followed his story. Packing up that cabin meant packing up the man the world had come to know. Think about what that actually involved. Decades of built life. Tools accumulated over the years. A craft practice rooted in that specific landscape. Trap lines that Tom had run so many times he could navigate them blind. A cabin that his own hands had maintained and improved season after season. All of it was left behind. Later, it was rumored that Tom and Nancy eventually relocated to Florida, and if that detail surprises you, it should. The man synonymous with Montana winters. The man who had stared down grizzlies and survived blizzards that would hospitalize most people. That man chose Florida. Not the mountains, or another remote wilderness property. Florida. That choice tells you everything about how serious what they were managing was. This was not a minor lifestyle adjustment. This was a full retreat from the life Tom had built. Health needs, Nancy's condition, and the physical reality of their age had collectively decided for them. Florida wasn't a preference, it was a necessity. When the fan community found out, the reaction was immediate and loud. Online forums dedicated to mountain men filled up with questions. Some fans refused to believe the relocation was voluntary. Conspiracy theories emerged. People convinced themselves the network had done something, that there had been a falling out, and that Tom had been pushed out rather than walking away on his own terms. Others took it personally in a quieter way. They had watched Tom for years. They had organized their weekly schedules around his segments. He had become something real to them. His exit felt like a loss that was difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. What did Tom say publicly about all of it? Very little, which was perfectly on brand for him. Tom Oar had never been a man who explained himself to anyone. He had built his entire life on the principle that your actions speak, and your words are mostly unnecessary. He wasn't about to change that philosophy at the end of his television run. There were a handful of interviews, brief, measured. He spoke about the decision to leave with the same quiet matter-of-factness he brought to everything else. Both he and Nancy were getting older. Life in Yaak had been extraordinary, but extraordinary has a cost, and they had paid it long enough. He didn't perform grief for the cameras, nor did he give anyone the emotional farewell they were looking for. He just moved on, the way he had always done everything, on his own terms. But here is the part that nobody was fully prepared for. Leaving Yaak was only the beginning of what Tom Oar was about to lose. Because the cabin, the trap lines, and the television show were just the visible losses, the things people could point to and name. What came next went deeper than any of that. This is the part of Tom Oar's story that most people who claim to know it have never actually heard. Everything he lost and what nobody talks about. There is a version of loss that people understand immediately. You can point to it, name it, explain it to someone at a dinner table, and watch them nod. Tom leaving Mountain Men was that kind of loss. Clean, visible, easy to grieve. But there was another kind of loss running underneath it. The kind that doesn't make fan forums, generate conspiracy theories, or goodbye tributes. This version happens quietly inside a life while the rest of the world is busy discussing the surface. That is the loss nobody talks about. Ironically, it is the one that actually mattered most. Think about what identity actually means for a man like Tom. He didn't define himself by a job title. He didn't have a LinkedIn profile, a professional network, or a corner office to retreat to. His identity lived entirely in the physical world, in his hands, in the land, in the daily practice of skills that most of the modern world has completely forgotten. Take away the land, and you take away the man. That is not an exaggeration. It is the most precise way to describe what the relocation from Yak Valley actually cost Tom Oar at the deepest level. Now let's talk about the financial reality. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable, and, therefore, rarely gets discussed honestly. Mountain Men was never a show that made its cast members wealthy in the traditional television sense. These were not actors negotiating studio contracts with agents fighting for back-end points. They were real people, most of them already living subsistence lifestyles, who were paid a production fee to allow cameras into their world. Estimates of what Mountain Men cast members earned per episode have varied widely across reports, but the consistent picture that emerged over the years was this. The income was supplemental, it was not life-changing. And it was entirely dependent on continued participation in the show. When Tom's participation ended, so did that supplemental income. For a man living off the grid in Montana, that income had slowly become more important than it might have appeared on screen. The romantic image of total self-sufficiency is beautiful in theory. In practice, even the most capable off-grid life requires money at certain pressure points. Equipment, medical needs, vehicle maintenance, supplies that the land simply cannot provide. Remove the show's income, and those pressure points become stress fractures. Then came the deeper loss. Nancy Oar's health had been declining. The woman who had been Tom's partner in every meaningful sense of the word, the foundation beneath everything he had built, was struggling in ways that demanded his complete attention. Tom had survived grizzlies. He had survived Montana winters that would break most people in 48 hours. But watching the person who had stood beside him through all of it face serious health challenges was a different kind of survival entirely, one that no wilderness skill prepared you for. This is the loss that doesn't get talked about in the fan forums, not the show, nor the yak cabin, or the trap lines. The quiet, private, devastating loss of watching your partner diminish, of reorganizing your entire existence around their needs, and becoming a caregiver when you had spent your whole life being a provider. That shift breaks something in a man, even a man as strong as Tom Oar. The isolation that followed the relocation added its own weight. In Yak, the solitude had been chosen. It had been purposeful. It had been surrounded by the land, the work, and the rhythm that gave it meaning. In Florida, the isolation was different. There was no trap line to run in the morning, no hide to tan, no wilderness pressing against the walls of the cabin, reminding Tom exactly who he was and what he was capable of. Just a quieter life in a warmer place. Far from everything that had ever defined him, the grizzlies never got Tom Oar. The blizzards never broke him. The rodeo never finished him, and neither did decades of brutal off-grid living. But life found a way. It always does. And yet, even here, right at the bottom of everything, Tom had lost. There was something still standing, something that neither age nor circumstance nor loss had managed to take from him completely. And that is where this story makes its final turn. The man who remains, after everything, the silence, the loss, the years. Where does a man like Tom Oar actually go? That is the question thousands of fans have been asking since he disappeared from their screens. Some searched online, many posted in forums. A lot of people reached out to anyone remotely connected to the show, hoping for a crumb of information. What they found was remarkably little, and that itself says something important. Tom Oar does not have a social media presence. He does not give regular interviews, nor does he appear at fan conventions or sign autographs at reality television meet-and-greet events. The man who never performed his life for the cameras has absolutely no interest in performing his retirement for the internet. Some things about a person never change. What we do know comes from scattered reports, occasional sightings, and the rare interview that Tom has granted in the years since leaving Mountain Men. And when you piece those fragments together, what emerges is a portrait that is both quieter and more complicated than most fans expected. Tom and Nancy settled in Florida. The man of Montana winters trades sub-zero temperatures for Gulf Coast humidity. The adjustment alone must have been its own kind of wilderness survival. But the move was never about comfort-seeking. It was about practicality, about being closer to medical care, and removing the life-threatening physical demands of yacht from the equation entirely. Nancy's health remained the central priority. Tom has spoken in brief, careful terms about this period, not with self-pity or with bitterness, but with the same plain-spoken directness that made him compelling to watch in the first place. He had built his life around Nancy as much as around the land. When the land had to go, Nancy remained. That was never a complicated calculation for him. But here is the thing about Tom Oar that the loss narrative misses entirely. He never stopped being who he was. Reports from people who have encountered him in recent years describe an older man, yes, slower perhaps, but fundamentally unaltered in the ways that matter. He still talks about craft with the intensity of someone for whom it is a calling rather than a hobby. He still carries himself with the quiet self-possession of a man who has never needed external validation to feel certain of his own worth. The buckskin work continued even after yacht. In a smaller space, with a different landscape outside the window, but the hands still knew what to do. Muscle memory that deep doesn't dissolve because your zip code changes. There is something almost defiant about that, in the best possible sense. Tom Oar spent decades building an identity so deeply rooted in physical skill and self-reliance that not even the most significant losses of his later life could pull it up completely. The land is gone, and the show is gone. The brutal Montana winters that tested him and proved him are gone. But the man who survived all of those things is still here. His legacy inside the Mountain Men universe is settled and significant. The show ran for 12 seasons. It introduced millions of Americans to a way of living that most had never considered possible. And of all the cast members across all those seasons, Tom Oar remained the one people talked about most. Not because he was the most dramatic, but because his segments were the most action-packed and the most authentic. There was no gap between the man on screen and the man in real life. What you saw was what existed, and that kind of honesty is rarer on television than anyone wants to admit. The fan community has never fully let him go. Online discussions about Tom surface regularly. People who grew up watching Mountain Men are now introducing the show to their own children. Tom's segments are the ones they start with. That is a particular kind of immortality. Quiet, unannounced, completely appropriate for the man himself. So what really happened to Tom Oar? He aged. He lost things. He made hard decisions with grace and without complaint. He prioritized the person he loved over the life that defined him, and he carried who he was into a smaller, quieter existence without losing the core of it. The wilderness didn't break Tom Oar. Life didn't break him either. It just changed him. The way everything real eventually changes everything real. And if you ask us, that is not a story about losing everything. It is a story about what survives. Tom Oar never asked for your sympathy. He wouldn't want it now. What he built in Yacht Valley, the craft, the life, the decades of honest living, nobody can take that from him. Not age or circumstance or the end of a television run. Some men are defined by what they accumulate. Tom Oar will always be defined by what he was willing to endure. That is a rare thing. In any era. If this story reminded you of why Tom was impossible to forget, drop a comment below. Tell us your favorite Mountain Men moment. And if someone in your life needs to hear this story, share it with them today.